So you've probably heard that you need to knit a gauge swatch, am I right? But let's be real. How many of us dread it or skip it altogether because we think it's all about trying to match the designer's perfect numbers? Well, I'm here to tell you that swatching is so much more than just hitting the right stitch count. In this video, we're flipping the script on gauge swatches and talking about how they help you, the knitter, create the fabric you love. Whether you're aiming for the perfect drape, durability, or simply just figuring out how much yarn to buy, let's turn swatching into your secret superpower. Hello, and welcome to the Wool Needles Hands Knitting Podcast. My name is Taylor, and I will be your host. In today's video, I want to talk to you about the often misunderstood and underestimated technique of swatching. For far too long, we have relegated this technique to the dark and disappointing corners of perfectionism, feeling that swatching is simply something that we did to see if we could get our numbers to match with those of the designer. And with that in mind, let's bust the biggest myth about gauge swatching. Gauge swatching is not just about matching the designer's gauge. Oftentimes, this is what we're told. Check gauge to make sure that you're going to be knitting to the same stitches per inch as the designer. Make sure that your gauge matches the designer. Go up or down a needle size to make sure your gauge matches the gauge shown in the pattern. And truthfully, focusing or even hyperfixating on doing just that can and will lead to so much frustration, disappointment, and ultimately project burnout. Gauge swatching is intended to be for your benefit, to help you learn about your yarn, your tools, your knitting style, and how all of that comes together to interact with a stitch pattern laid out by the designer, and how that's going to create and produce the fabric you're ultimately going to wear on your body. The fabric being used in your project is so important, and you want to make sure you get that just right. And that, I argue, is where swatching is invaluable. So no, it is not just about matching the gauge of the designer. That could be part of it, and my hat's off to you if you're always able to match the gauge of the designer every time or even some of the time, but it's just not the reality for a vast majority of folks. And so I want you to rethink your swatching process so that you know it is way more than just that. Reason number one that swatching is more than just matching the ideal gauge of the designer is because you get to find your ideal fabric. Once you knit a gauge swatch, you have created a small piece of the fabric that is going to go into your project. Whether it's a hat, a pair of mittens, or even a sweater, you want to know what that fabric is going to feel like. If you're going to sew a garment, you're going to purchase fabric at a fabric store, and you want to make sure that you like that fabric. You like the drape of the fabric, the way it feels in your hand, how it interacts with your skin, before you take all the time into putting it into a garment. A great jumping off point for starting your swatch is the gauge that's listed in the pattern. And that is simply what it is. It's a jumping off point. It's not an end point. It's not the finish line. It's a place to get you started. So by all means, take the needle recommended and the yarn weight recommended, or if you're lucky enough to have the exact yarn, you can do that as well. Knit your gauge swatch and see what you think about it. If you really love the fabric that you produced with that needle and that yarn, then this is the swatch for you, and you need to move forward with your project with the data and information that you can gather from that swatch. If that is the fabric you love and the feel that you love with all of those characteristics, then that is what you should go for. Don't change your needle size to make that swatch tighter or looser to match the gauge of the designer, because that's going to compromise your overall fabric and change a very important element of your project. Stick to what you have and use that swatch to move further into your project. I have a video that tells you how to use your gauge to determine which size to knit in a knitting pattern. And if you've not watched this video and you would like to dive into what I'm talking about right now a little bit further, I highly recommend that you watch that video. It's a great one to watch if you want to get in the driver's seat of your knitting project. Another reason we swatch is to figure out what's going to happen to our fabric once we block our project. There's nothing worse than knitting a swatch and choosing to go straight from finished swatch right into the project without blocking your swatch, only to realize that blocking drastically distorted your finished project. And by distorted, I mean anything from stretching it out, causing it to shrink, who knows, whatever it's going to do after blocking, except for the person who blocks their swatch. Swatching is going to help us be more informed. For example, and I have an example for you here, this is a blocked swatch using a particular yarn. This is the same yarn in an unblocked swatch. You can see things are curling in. You can see that this one's a little bit smaller. Same number of stitches in terms of its width. However, the blocked swatch is longer than the unblocked swatch. And it's kind of easy to see that there's obvious differences here. The yarn and the fabric behaved differently post-blocking than it did prior to blocking. And that means your garment or whatever it is that you're knitting is also going to behave differently. If you're not sure if a superwash yarn is going to grow or stretch when you knit it into a sweater, then you need to knit a swatch and then block the swatch. Measure the swatch prior to blocking and take note of that measurement. Block the swatch, measure it again. Do you notice an increase in size and dimension? By how much? What's the percentage of difference? Because that's the percentage of difference you can bet your finished garment is going to be once you block it. That information is valuable, and if you have that information in check, you are in far more control of your knitting project. I will be taking a deep dive down that particular rabbit hole over on Patreon, so if you are not a member of Patreon and you would like to help support the channel, definitely head over that way, because that video, as well as some other gauge swatching deep dives, are heading over to the Patreon very soon. Just like blocking is going to have an effect on the overall fabric, so is wear. When you create a gauge swatch, you have something that you can manipulate and test its durability and its likelihood to pill. If you're knitting with a fiber like cashmere or something that has a pretty high propensity for pilling, this allows you to play around a little bit with the fabric by roughing it up, throwing it in the dryer, whatever it is that you want to do to replicate the reality of you using that item. Do it with your swatch before you have to do it with the finished item. If you notice that it's really easy to get your swatch to pill, you can bet the sweater that you're going to knit with that yarn is going to pill like crazy. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't knit the sweater with that yarn. It just means that you be prepared, and you might want to have a depiller on hand. I have a video here on the channel where I demonstrate a few different options for depillers. Definitely check that out. But this gauge swatch will give you the information you need to know if you're even going to need to consider those tools to begin with. And if you've ever had the question of whether or not you can actually wash the yarn that you're using, if it claims to be washable on the label, but you're just not sure, well, test it with your gauge swatch. It's a small amount of yarn, and it's worth the risk that you take to damaging your swatch to know for sure if the item can be washed in the washing machine. This is especially important if you're knitting for babies. Another really important reason to swatch outside of any context of trying to match a designer's gauge is to play around with the stitch pattern that's being used in the design with the yarn you have on hand, especially if you're planning on substituting out a different yarn for the yarn recommended by the designer. You might find a yarn that meets the gauge requirements and even the wraps per inch of the yarn being used by the designer, but the fiber content might be different. It might be a cotton where the designer uses a wool, and you might find that the recommended stitch pattern, which is very textured, just doesn't hold up very well with a cotton yarn. By swatching with the yarn you've chosen, you really get an idea of how that stitch pattern is going to look with your yarn. And this also goes as well for color work projects. You may have chosen a collection of colors to knit a particular colorwork project, only to find that once you've knit your gauge swatch with those colors, they don't really go well together, or they're not as contrasty as you would like. You can make some changes, adjust some things with the colors of yarn that you're using, and move forward in your project with a lot more confidence. Lastly, but certainly not least, is using your gauge swatch to estimate your yarn requirements for a project based on your gauge swatch and not some arbitrary numbers provided to you in a knitting pattern. Because the chances are that your personal gauge is going to differ from that from the designer, using your stitches per square inch and comparing that to the stitches per square inch of the designer, finding the percentage difference there and using that to determine your overall yarn needs is going to provide you with the information you need to make sure you have enough yarn for the project based on your stitch count and your overall gauge. And that's going to provide you with the information that you need to make sure you're purchasing the correct amount of yarn for your project based on your particular gauge. Well, there you have it. Swatching isn't just some boring chore that leads to disappointment and frustration. It's a fantastic superpower that gets you closer to your yarn and your fabric and puts you in the driver's seat of your project. Embrace swatching as a tool for your creativity and control, rather than just some boring and, in some cases, seemingly meaningless step in the process. Let me know your experiences with swatching. If you have some testimonials you would like to share down below, let me know, let folks know, because we learn so much from one another down in the comment sections of these videos. Thank you guys so much for taking your time to hang out with me. If you took value from today's video or enjoyed yourself at any point, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up, definitely subscribe, and click that bell icon so you can be notified anytime I upload new content. And like I said, if you'd like to dive deeper down some rabbit holes with me, head over to Patreon and see if it's for you. Until next time, happy knitting, happy making, happy whatever it is that you're doing. Take care, be well, and I will see you soon. Bye.